Almost all the big corporates saw it coming.
It saved him £250,000.
The Bank of England have published a few bits about this. That refinancing wall is going to have an impact over the next 6 months plus.
Has anyone reduced their prices? Of course they haven't. When she got to 100 million followers, that was the darkest period she'd ever had in her life.
Put the right people around you, talk to your competition, put things into perspective, and every day's a new day.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another 6 Rounds episode on the Blueprint Podcast. I'm joined by a very special guest today, Adam Lawrence, who is the co-founder of Partners in Property. He's also the co-founder of the Boardroom Club. He is a very long-standing, experienced investor. He's built a portfolio in the hundreds of units. He has multiple degrees, including a master's from Oxford. And most importantly, the reason I've invited him on to join us today is of all of the people that I read who put stuff out there in our industry, he's one of the most intelligent writers that I read. And I love a lot of the stuff that he puts out about business, property, and specifically economics. So we're going to have a great 6 rounds today. Without further ado, we're going to go to the first round and we're going to kick things off. Welcome, Adam.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you. My pleasure. What an intro.
Let's live up to it. First round, you're up.
Okay, so my first choice first round was, unsurprisingly after that intro, economics and risk.
Amazing. So we're obviously in a turbulent time at the minute. The economics or the economy, nobody seems to know where it's going, what it's doing. Predictably, my view is it's more predictable than people think. I think there seems to be this huge uncertainty, but I think it's more predictable. And the whole risk thing is, to me, more of it's an attraction, an appeal of doing deals, being in business, because whilst there's high risk, there's low competition. And when there's low competition, there's high margins. And for me, I enjoy this. We talked briefly before we started about the pandemic. I found that to be a very lucrative period. So for me, I'm not concerned. I'm enjoying it to a degree. What are you saying?
I think that's pretty good. I think there's a few things that spring to mind here. You know, the old Warren Buffett, be fearful when others are greedy, be greedy only when others are fearful, is a really good phrase to remember, because it builds on exactly where your mindset needs to be at times like this. And I've got a friend who's a mortgage broker who's been in the game 40 plus years. And one thing he says is, you're looking back over 2008, looking back over 1990s recession, all the rest of it, his long-standing clients, all the money that they're sitting on these days, or nearly all the money they're sitting on, is because of good deals that they did at times like this, when people are either too scared, too fearful, too whatever to get any business done. So I think it's a fantastic opportunity. We did have a quick chat about stuff that was available in the pandemic that you knew at the time. I mean, we bought an entertainment and business centre in the East Mids in the height of the pandemic. I remember going to look around, and it was like looking around a ghost ship or something like that. You know, bowling alley was closed, sports hall was closed, soft play was closed, offices were still going okay, and that was at the point where people could go to work if they needed to. And it was a complete no. The price we bought it for was, for some of the areas of the site, the price we would rent it out for 1 year. Yeah. So I mean, you know, I appreciate it wasn't a great time for everybody, but people had just decided they wanted to shift it, and it's a bit like buying a plot with no planning on it or whatever. If you get it at the right price, it's not too much of a problem. So that's what we've done. So I think that's the overall picture. Is it's difficult because we haven't really got a lot of historical precedent for these sorts of times, like after a pandemic. We've got very limited data. You know, I'm a big data geek and economic history geek, and you know, Ray Dalio style suits me down to the ground. You know, go back and look at what's happened before, and then try and learn from that. But for 100 years, we haven't had a pandemic, so it's quite difficult. And then when we did have one, there was a world war as well, so it's difficult to sort of decouple all the impacts of all of that. But I did quite a bit of work on this during the sort of early, like April, May 2020, in the early days of the pandemic. So so after a pandemic, what do the next 30 or 40 years look like?
And when we put it back to with the initial point around risk and be greedy when others are fearful, I think there's another quote as well. I don't know if it's Warren Buffett, but it says, when there's blood on the streets, buy property. Yeah. And it's like, for someone like you and I, who we said, you know, these times are great business opportunities, but the reason for that is the masses are running for the hills. that's all well and good for people like us to say, but the reason people are running for the hills is because the front page of the paper says the world's going to end. And when you're on Property Entrepreneur the other day, I said, if I'd have said to anyone on Property Entrepreneur or in the property market 18 months ago, here's a button. If you remember what the market was like 18 months ago, everyone was queuing up to buy property. Prices were going up every month. Everyone was buying for over the asking price. Everything was best and finals. And I said, press this button and I'll take you to a place where there's no competition. You can offer 10, 20% below market value. There's nobody to compete with. How many people would press it? Absolutely everyone. Well, that's where we are today. They've pressed the button, we're here. But when you're actually there and the market's going down and finance is expensive, it's a very difficult, even I have that gut feeling of like, maybe I'm wrong. And I bought a site similar to you. In the middle of the pandemic, I could have knocked it down and sold the bricks and still made money. And I literally looked at it and thought, I rang the agent at 9 in the morning and said, yeah, I'll buy it for £250,000 or whatever it was. I knew I could pay £500,000 for it. Ended up being worth nearly £1 million once I developed it, or nearly £2 million once I developed it. Made the best part of £1 million on it. But I had that confidence that I just knew that for the history of time, the market comes back around. But you've got to be real ballsy in that time and brave to go and do those deals, because everyone, including Crowd Property, Rick's surveyors, agents, told me I was going to lose my money. I was off the charts. My commercial valuation came in at 1.1 million. It was going to cost me more than that to develop, but I still did it. I still built it, made over £1 million or nearly £1 million on it. How do we give people the confidence to go and, or I suppose that's the beauty of it. Nobody has the confidence today.
Well, I think you've got to look at, certain things I've always looked at ever since I started trying to build my portfolio. Like, what does it cost to build? Economics is about supply and demand, but it's also about things like substitute goods and complementary goods. And the beautiful thing about housing, of course, as an investment is that there's very few substitutes. You can live in an HMO rather than a one-bedroom flat, let's say, if there's only one of you, or sometimes couples in HMOs or whatever, people's niches and things like that. There's very few substitutes for the 3-bed family home near a school, or none, really. So I always looked at places where to rebuild, or where the new builds were 30, 40, 50, 60% more expensive than the secondary market stock. And I always looked at the rebuild value of the property. And one of the things that people aren't talking about at the moment, because everybody's so bearish, like you said, is construction costs are up 40, 45% if you take the official figures. Some jobs seem to us to cost twice as much as they did 4 years ago, probably. It's more like 100%. But those rebuild costs have been dragged upwards. So either the gap between the new build stock gets so big, nobody wants to buy the new build and they stick with the secondary market, or what I've seen happening all along ever since I've been doing this is the secondary market values are just rising and rising to try and keep up with the new build stock. And whilst it's easy to say at the minute the market's going down, when you get into the figures and you pull them apart, most of that is happening in the south of England and around London, and southwest as much as the southeast, where they did have fairly big bumps over the sort of 2020 to 2022 period. And actually there's a fair few bits of the Midlands and the north that's still going up. They're not rocketing, but they're actually up 1-2% year on year. It's not so much reason to be as bearish, but you've got to just put the noise to one side, haven't you? And that's why I love the data so much, because the data's got no agenda and it's got no friends. And as long as you can read it without trying to tick your own boxes and mark your own homework and persuade everyone everything's always brilliant. If you remember, go back to the time you were just talking about, big companies were saying, the market's going to go down 40%. 42%, I think, was the biggest number I saw. And I remember April 2020 thinking, I think things could go down a bit here before all the stimulus had been announced and everything. And then I got to the early May and I thought, no, lower value properties, they're not going down. They're not going down at all, because people are going to want yield. And if you remember back, yields were crushed. We were at 0.1% base rate. Bond yields you got nothing for saving money anywhere, 0.0 for saving money. So if you could yield, even with debt, even with operational costs, if you could yield 5% out of a property, you were beating the risk-free rate by 5%. And then you've got the capital growth on top of that, which is what has always historically looked after property investors so well. It's difficult because when you're in the heat of battle and you're looking, right, cash flow, there's cash flow pressures for people at the moment, and the banks and the bridging lenders and everybody else taking a little bit more of a bite out of the deal. So it makes it a little bit harder to justify. But what are you buying, and where the deal you were talking about, where does the majority of the money come from? Well, you've done a big value add with what you've done, and then the money's there on paper until you sell it, and then there's cash flow.
I think this is a really key point as well. Is like acknowledging the difference between shocks and shifts, because if you'd have looked at residential property was never really a cash like buy to let's what you're talking about. And we actually created a strategy before the pandemic called BBC, which was below build cost. And I was buying stuff in the northeast of like, if I can buy a 3-bed semi-detached house for 80 grand, the reality is you couldn't physically build it for that, let alone with the land. So it's like fundamentally, if you're going to hold it forever, it's unlikely to end up in negative equity, short of something huge happening. But when we talk about shocks and shifts, buy-to-let property wasn't really, before bottomed out interest rates, it was never really a cash flow strategy, was it? That's why we had things like HMOs and service accommodation. It was like they were your cash flow. But then as your appetite for squeezing the pips reduced and you start to look at single-let stocks on buy-to-let mortgages, there was a sweet spot for about 3 or 5 years where you could make 250, 300, 400 quid on a single let. And we're now going into a different period where I suppose I'm going to go into the next round now, which I was going to take us into property, but we're covering economics and property. So we're doing the next round on both. Is with rates going so high, again, we briefly spoke about it before we started, is when we've got rates so high, we are moving to a position where single lets won't cash flow. And the basic logic is if it's yielding 6% and buy-to-let finance is 6%, nobody's going to go and buy buy-to-let stock with a buy-to-let mortgage. But the law of logic says that that's not going to be sustainable. Something's got to happen. So economically and property for round 2, what do you think is going to happen? We've got all this, the uncertainty seems to be what is going to happen. I think it's quite clear what's going to happen. What do you think is going to happen?
I think it's probably quite easy because I think it started happening already. So we've had a market where people forget what inflation does to markets because we haven't had any for 40 years. So you've got all of these people in senior positions in the Bank of England, Monetary Policy Committee, government, investment firms, whatever. They don't understand inflation in terms of living through it. And the only way you can is by going back and doing the historical legwork to see. Last real time anybody dealt with it, John Major, early 90s. Not too many people hanging around from 33 years ago, especially as politicians tend to come into politics near the end of their career.
Including myself, what sort of inflation did we see there? And what was it?
So we saw double digit at one point. So we saw a peak in the housing market in 1989, relating it directly to housing, which then it slumped a bit till 1994. But the real drop, so if you went back to say 1980, average UK house price 20 grand. 1989, average UK house price 60 grand, so it had trebled. Get to 1994, average UK house price 55 grand. So we had a 10% drop, but it was a much, much bigger drop than that because in real terms, inflation in that point had gone from, there'd been about 30% inflation from 89 to 94 if you added it all up. So it wasn't dissimilar to last October's numbers. Hit about 10.5%, and then it took about 4 years to bottom out. And
what did rates do during that period?
So we started from a point where rates were high, sort of 8s, 9s, and then first of all, you'll remember the one that everybody talks about. Oh, I remember when the mortgage rate went up to 18%. 18%. Yeah.
But it was like one night, wasn't it?
It was an afternoon, basically. Yeah. And then it went down from the base rate of interest went from 10 to 15 in one day. And within 5 days' time, they had it back down to 8.75 because they realised they were going the wrong way and what that would do. Now, remember at the time as well, loads more people with variable rate mortgages, loads more people with bigger loan to values because we were in that. What led to that boom between 80 and 87 and 89? It was Thatcher's economics, bit of right to buy. It was all booming until they withdrew mortgage interest release at source. MIRAS, because people used to get tax relief on their salary for paying their mortgage, which was obviously an absolute dream. But then you had on the back of that Housing Act 1988, which would have then led to a double boom if the market wasn't doing what it was doing. Instead, it was really sort of 96 when it took off because that was the first real iteration of the buy-to-let mortgage, which was based on the fact that you could recover possession of an asset and you didn't have tenants for life and all of that stuff that you had before the Housing Act 1988.
And when we look at that period and compare it today, like looking towards the next 12 months, 36 months, 5 years, what are you anticipating? What are you expecting? How's it going to play out?
Yeah, so I think you see inflation with a big, long sting in the tail, which is exactly what we're seeing. It's difficult to get it down. We had a period of...
Are you seeing in real time? Because, we talk about, so George Soros says that inflation isn't driven, like reflexivity isn't driven by monetary and fiscal policy. It's driven by what's written on the front page of the paper. When you go around Birmingham or when I go around Sheffield and you're looking at restaurants, shopping centres, people's attitudes, are you seeing this shock cost of living crisis, people not spending, restaurants empty?
I think it depends where you go. I remember being in the East Mids a while back, and there's a big outlet mall. We were near that centre that I was talking about earlier. And I went there and I just looked around. I just thought, recession, what recession? I mean, are you joking? It was a swarm of people buying stuff, whether they're spending it on credit cards or whatever, I don't know. But then being involved in that business that has got a leisure arm to it, you can see where people have cut back. Monday night and Tuesday night are a lot quieter than they used to be. I think that's the cost of living biting. But still, if you get something interesting happening, you get something different going on, people will still come out and they'll spend like they've never spent before. And I've never seen an environment where prices go up as easily as they have done and people just swallow it. Because going back to your original question about like expectations, basically, and the George Soros point of view, expectations are everything in inflation. It's not what's happening, because all you get is people going, well, it hasn't gone up for me, or it's gone up 10 times that. All these figures are a load of rubbish. But it's really what you think is going to happen, because what you think is going to happen is going to define what you're going to do as an individual economic agent and then as a society as a whole. So if everybody thinks that kitchens are going to go up 30% in the next 12 months, a lot of people will start bringing forward the purchase of a kitchen because they think, right, I want to get in before it goes up. Whereas if they think prices are going to go down, which nobody ever talks about deflation, but it's a 10 times bigger problem than inflation. Deflation, then people then think, right, I'll defer consumption. And you start this sort of death spiral in the economy where people aren't consuming, because we have a very, apart from the US.
And that's the shock factor. When everyone decides, right, wow, the world's going to end, it's like bang, overnight, nobody's going to the restaurants. Everyone's sitting on their hard-earned cash. And with this sting in the tail, you're talking about this delayed inflationary sting. Like, we would have expected that in the property market, right? People coming off the fixed terms, this adjustment, but we're not seeing that. And there seems to be a few reasons for that, as in like the property market, obviously the aim was to really suppress people's spending, but when their biggest spending is their mortgage, or obviously the rent has gone up for people who are renting, but mortgages, there seems to be so many mechanisms. In one hand, they're trying to reduce spending, increase cost, but then the other hand, you can pretty much get out of your mortgage increases at the minute by holidays, interest only. Like, do you feel like we're failing to slam our feet on the brakes in that capacity?
I think there's probably one more thing to inject into that, and I think what you said is very true. I think there's one more thing to inject into that, and that was the pandemic period, where we saw people forced to save money, and savings rates went through the roof because they couldn't consume it on restaurants or whatever. So, they did their best on Just Eat or whatever, and that's why all the tech stocks did so well. People spent more on Amazon, they spent more on Deliveroo or whatever, but they didn't spend what they were spending before. And then you've got the point about, remember that, and this is why the market hasn't done what people think, and I don't see why people have struggled to miss this point. FCA did the mortgage market review, PRA, did the mortgage market review in 2012, and when that came out, mortgages were stress tested at 5.5% pay rate, right? Even when we went through the lowest periods of, now remember 2012, the yields weren't as low as they were now. The bonds were still at sort of 1.5%. Obviously, we got to a point in 2020 when they were literally at zero. So that 5.5% was still the affordability test. Now, there's two things that means, right? First of all, people can afford 5.5% when they got underwritten for their mortgage.
Which is one example of where the banks have actually done something right in the last 5 years. That was savvy, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, really, really savvy, because it stopped the market.
When base was 0.5%.
Yeah.
That's a bold test to put in.
It was, and they looked like they knew there was very little roadmap for that to increase, but they knew they always wanted to increase it. They just didn't really sort of put their back into it, if you like. Yeah. But then the second point is, then people saved the money, right? So, or they didn't spend it on financing. So you were afforded 5.5%, but you were paying 2.5%, let's say. And some people obviously were paying lower on their home mortgages. What happened to that extra 3% every year on your average home loan at a couple of $100,000, let's say, that's $6,000 a year. You can bet your bottom dollar 80+% of people will have spent it.
Yeah,
right.
bottomless brunches, four-star martinis. They're like, we've lived a great life for the last 5 years. Whatever you want, whenever you want it, tomorrow. You can have what you want.
We're a consumption-led economy at the end, and we're not the United States, but we're a big consumption-led economy. So people will always go out and do that. There will be the 20% or the 10% that chipped away at their mortgage balance and saved it away and all the rest of it. And actually, the savings rates, interestingly, did react. Whereas if you look at someone like Japan that's had very, very low inflation for 30 years, and they call it the lost decades and stuff like this, I think there's a bit of a lesson in there for the UK, and that's why it worried me so much when Liz Truss got elected, because one of the things she said is we should learn from the monetary policy of Japan, and I was like, it's been a complete disaster for 30 years. What we should learn is don't do what they've done. That's the problem. And then
just out of interest, what did you think of her pitch? Obviously, it was badly timed, but fundamentally, had it have been better delivered, do you think that strategy, that Reaganomics model, would have been effective?
I think the whole of the last, I'm not even going to pick on her specifically. I think everything that from George Osborne all the way through to Kwasi Kwarteng, everything was potentially right at completely the wrong time. I like the positivity of the chat. I like the individual responsibility side of it. To look at that mini budget they delivered as a speech, I actually quite like some bits in there. To look at the timing of it, it was so bad, and that's why hedge fund managers made so much money from, taking him out to dinner or whatever they did, and then short selling the bonds. I mean, it was obvious that it was completely the wrong time to do something like that.
Well played. I think everyone's going to want to hear more about that, so no doubt we're going to come back to it. Just out of interest, what do you know? What like wealth dynamics profile you are?
Have a guess. I do know. Yeah,
probably like a mechanic or creative mechanic.
Creative mechanic. Yeah, bang on. Bang on.
And just out of interest on the stats thing, because you're a stats guy, and you said about people having these retained earnings from pandemic, like because there was so much stimulus, but then in real terms, there's this cost of living crisis. And I was looking at some of the stats, and some of it said, yeah, everyone's got loads of savings. Some of it said 80% of it was on corporations' balance sheets. Like, did people actually have that much post-pandemic savings? Or
so the Bank of England got some pretty good figures around this stuff, although they're not as certain as they'd like to be. And their thoughts were, this was why in 2021, at the time, the chief economist, Andy Haldane, was saying, I'm concerned about inflation because people have got these savings, and I think they're going to come out and spend them when they get unshackled, sort of thing. And then, in a way, the cost of living crisis kind of stopped that from happening a little bit because people had to use those savings to try and keep up. And then you get to the point where, say, even to this summer, where 2023 summer has looked a bit more like a traditional summer, a lot of people have gone abroad. So a lot of people who've got holiday lets and things had a fantastic year in 2022, but it was always going to be a good year, and there was always going to be a danger of the cheap flight is not quite dead yet, although some of the prices went up so much, it was incredible. But they've used their money to make up for what they've missed out. And this was, remember going back to the Spanish flu pandemic, the roaring was one of the things that was in my analysis a few years ago.
20s.
The roaring 20s was because people thought they were lucky to still be alive.
Yeah,
the war plus the pandemic, and they just said, life's too short.
Let's have loads of kids and let's spend loads of money.
and they had 10 years of the same porn star martinis and everything you were just talking about. And then we got to the Depression because things were not shackled in any way and under control in any way. We've learned a bit about economics since then, luckily, so we're not in the same boat. But, of course, we're not having the roaring 20s at the moment, realistically. We had this bit of a zoom upwards, and then, in a way, Liz Truss did everybody a favour because she pricked the bubble before it got too big. And that actually will have helped out a bit. It's not what she meant to do, but that shock upwards in the bond yields and stuff when that mini budget was delivered actually calmed the market right down.
And the value of knowing all this stuff is when we're talking about playing the game, and it's all a game. Like the biggest thing you can understand with all of this is we're not all victims of whatever the government, the economy does. It's all about understanding how to play the game. And again, when we've got shocks and shifts, the shift is now it's very unlikely we're going to go anywhere near the fantasy times of 0.1% base rate short of another pandemic, or let's not even say the words that could be that cause that sort of thing. But when you're talking about things like these spikes, like for example, staycations, there was this spike. Those people who then ran in and bought tech stocks in that industry, expecting it to last forever, that's where you get it wrong. Whereas if you understood how to play the game, you would do a back-to-back lease on a couple of plots of land, lease it to somebody else, and just do those pop-up sites where you can get in, get out. And it's understanding what's here to stay fundamentally and what's not. So you don't get caught in the tulip mania, the Bitcoin, the crypto, the AI. It's like fundamentally there's something happening there. But if you're just going to make money on the spike, it goes down quicker than it comes up. So banging. Right, round 3, over to you.
Okay, so for third round, I had mental health.
Interesting.
And the reason why I chose that was because I'm seeing more and more I'm a big observer in the real world, right? I remember early days of the pandemic and going to the shops, and I wasn't particularly scared at all. I had a fairly level-headed approach to the whole thing, but everyone was masked up. And I remember seeing people's eyes like behind their masks, and they looked so scared, like real genuine fear. This was the time when, toilet rolls were evaporating and pasta was in short supply and all the rest of it. And what I see at the moment, because obviously, whilst I don't deal with the tenants myself day to day, I still interact very closely with tenancy managers and all the rest of it, is that they're angry, they're short-tempered, they won't be reasonable about things. And I'm not having a go at tenants when I say that. I'm seeing that in all walks of business. People's tempers are short, and they just seem to be, to me, to need a lot more of a chill pill. I was listening to one of your pods earlier on, and you were talking about, you said the words, nobody wants to work anymore, and it made me laugh because I've said the same thing in terms of what I've observed from people. But also, I think there's a little bit of it being cultured into us, because what happened, the pandemic came, we put our hands up and then said, oh, let the government look after us. Then all everybody did was moan about what the government did during the pandemic. But when it's all done for you, like it has been, and then you've got what is comparatively a luxury of working from home for a lot of people, that was a new thing that came to them, suddenly there just seemed to be a little bit of a sense of entitlement, but also there's a lot to deal with. Because I think if you looked at how many negative messages are there in the news in 2023 versus 2019, let's say, I don't know the answer to that. I've not seen the survey done, but I bet it's a lot. I bet it's 4 times as many or something like that. So you've got this constant barrage. How many times has the word crisis been used in the last 18 months? Mortgage crisis in the States, cost of living crisis, everything's a housing crisis, everything's a crisis.
Yeah.
And it's like, if all the messages,
mental health crisis.
Yeah, and if all the messages you're getting are that, but of course the other thing is, if you don't, everybody saw working from home as a big what a benefit. And like I said, I'm a stats nerd, so I see the average commute was 1 hour 53 minutes a day or something like that, and I just thought, wow. All of those, 10 million, 20 million people, however many it is, with all that extra time in a day, what a positive thing that could be for productivity, for companies, for people's health, if they wanted to use it in that way. In general, it's freeing them from having to go from A to B. But has it actually worked out like that? Has anybody been told how to work well from home? Look, of course, this is stuff you can figure out for yourself if you put the time and effort into it, but not everybody does. So does it mean instead you sort of get up, you don't bother to get dressed properly, you start work a bit earlier, then you get distracted by something, or you take the dog for a walk in the middle of the day or whatever.
You look up and you haven't left the house for 6 months.
Well, exactly. And that can't possibly be good for mental health. So I thought it would be worth us having a round on that, really, Dan.
Yeah, spot on. And so many considerations. So at a macro level, there's the nanny state. So where we are as an economy, I've been saying, unless we pull a rabbit out of the hat, and you'd like to see it under a Conservative government, or I would like to see it under a Conservative government. If Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt were given enough runway, with the strategy they've got at the minute, it's very savvy, it's very economical, it logically would make sense. Balance the books, invest in long-term growth, but do the short-term stuff now, like scrap HS2. We don't need HS2 now. We need that short-term stimulus in the local areas. It all just makes a lot of logical sense. But at a macro level, the UK economy is like on borrowed time, in my opinion. It's like this lethargic, overweight, lazy economy that doesn't go to work anymore. It's a nanny state. We have entitlement. We're entitled to everything: healthcare, days off, beanbags, and free lunches. It's like we've gone full circle. And if you take the two polar opposites, and you've got, the analogy I use is of sports stars. If you think about Mike Tyson, when he became the heavyweight champion of the world, and he used to go running in the snow at 2 a.m, And the reason was nobody else would do it. And you look at the economies that are growing now around the world, and how economies over the last 20 years have come out of poverty, like China, places like that. They brought people from the rice fields out of poverty, and the opportunity to work 7 days a week, 12-hour days was a luxury because they were getting money, they were getting fed, they were getting housing. You extrapolate that out over 5 generations or whatever the data would be, and you end up with the UK that's just this privileged. You mentioned Ray Dalio earlier. I'm assuming you've read like New World Order.
Yeah.
It's just textbook, right? It's we're all bickering over should we be able to work from home or not, and all the other economies around the world are going to take over, become the new sovereign, and it's like you just think, yeah, I can just see that. So at a macro level, I think we're all resting on our laurels. We've become lazy. Working from home is not a productivity gain per hour worked. The UK has a huge productivity issue. The only people that I think would increase in productivity are people that would have a job that lends itself well to that. And also they have to be a self-starter. So let's say how many industries work well to that, like probably coding, real deep work, data analysts. You need to be on your own, really. And then what percentage of those people are self-starters? Well, in the UK, I would say it's probably 10, 20%. Outside of that, it's probably not a productivity gain, is my instinct at a macro level. But equally, if you look at the financial gain, if you don't have to have an office and a supervisor and a manager and lunch breaks covered, and all of a sudden there is this working from home, the efficiencies that you gain in overheads could actually outweigh the loss in productivity from having people working from home. So, and then the mental health thing is, I've shared and talked about mental health lots of times, and I think there's a whole spectrum. I think there's it's definitely something that's more accessible now, and it's discussed and it's more open. So there probably is a degree of using it more, and it's like everyone who feels bad gets antidepressants because they're just available off the shelf. Probably not the best thing to do. In the same case that everyone can say, I've got mental health issues, some people fundamentally do have mental health issues. Other people just don't exercise. There's a whole spectrum there that needs to be addressed. And we're living in an economy and a society and a time in life which actually, unless you proactively try not to end up with mental health issues by exercising, when there's only 7 hours of daylight, it's very hard to exercise this time of year. You go to the supermarket and 80% of the stuff is inedible, and it's bright packaging. It's not going to make you feel good. And your phone is going bing, bing, bing. You've got pictures of your friends on the beach with six packs and bikini bodies. Social media's going off. The news is telling you there's a crisis. It's like you would have to try really hard not to feel negative and have mental health issues mentally, emotionally, or physically in the current time. So huge topic, few little sound bites, and that's my initial thought.
I think you sort of touched on how you combat some of that, really, because it's some really interesting stuff you just said. I think you've got to take it at least as seriously as you take the physical gym, if you're someone who goes to the gym, or however you get your exercise. If you get no exercise, that's a problem. I think part of social media's problem is that it can also mean everybody thinks even if they're 68 years old, they've got to do CrossFit or something like that, which isn't necessarily, and I don't think age should necessarily be a barrier, but I do think age-appropriate exercise is a good idea. But I think it comes back to you've got to be responsible for that yourself, and your mental health is going to be, in many ways, more important than your physical health. So it's got to be prioritised, and you've got to educate yourself, because the nanny state isn't going to do it for you, because it's decades behind on this sort of stuff, and it won't catch up for that many years. And what do you need to do? How good for you is it to go and get some sunlight every day? How good for you is it to make sure you just do the little things, just such as taking a bit of exercise after a meal to make sure it digests better? What's that going to do for you? It's going to help you sleep better. Now, that is obviously physical health as well as mental health, but there's no better way to affect your mental health than messing with your sleep pattern. And I'm someone who, because I've got a brain that's constantly running over, historically, I've had problems with my own sleep, but I've had to address them myself and educate myself on how to do that. And it's been over a period of many years, whereas now I'm very comfortable with, I'm wearing a wearable device that watches what I'm doing while I sleep, what my blood oxygen is like, and all the rest of it. But again, that's all well and good. But if it just spews out data and you don't do anything with the data, it doesn't mean anything. So I think you've got to be proactive with this stuff, and you've got to accept, rather than, and I have a big fear about society in this day and age where we diagnose more and more stuff. And that could be, if you're a bit of a conspiracy theorist, you say, well, it's because Big Pharma want to prescribe more and more medication. And of course, you've got to be concerned whenever there's big companies making big profits, and it's worth asking big questions about stuff like that. But you've got to really get to the root cause of, as an individual, all you can really do is help yourself. We've got this incredible privilege, really, in the UK, such that we can have big concerns about particular sections of the community because we're not worrying about, as a general rule, where does the next meal come from? You know, even at the bottom of the food chain, one thing you can do relatively easily in parts of the country is go to a food bank. I'm not saying that's great. I'm not saying that's the best, that's where you want your life to be, but you can do that. Whereas all of those other countries you're talking about that are roaring ahead with their economic growth, they haven't got a third sector who are really doing work like that. The charities they've got come from places like the UK. They're not from anywhere else, and they've got to worry about when you've got to worry about where the next meal's coming from. That gives people a drive that you just don't have when you're. And this comes onto the old, one generation to make it, one to enjoy it, and one to lose it, which is a big factor for any entrepreneur who's listening, who's thinking, right, okay, what are you doing? What are you trying to achieve? What are you trying to give your kids? Because if you give them money, the problem can be the sense of entitlement side of things. Whereas I try and give mine knowledge and lessons. And like all kids, most of them they don't listen to, right? I try all sorts of tactics to get them to listen. But occasionally something gets through and they'll say something like, right, they might fail at something. And I encourage them to try and do things they'll fail at and then say, right, okay, that's an opportunity to learn. We didn't learn anything from the deal that went incredibly well. It was like clockwork. It was on time. It was on point. It was on budget.
Which never happens.
But sometimes we get luck. In honesty, that's more luck than skill, right? And it happens. And you get to the reval and you've put in a punchy number and you get it and you think, wow, jolly good. Aren't I brilliant? And then you just move on to the next thing. You don't debrief that. Whereas the ones that go wrong, instead of hiding under the bedclothes or whatever, you've got to look at and break down and go, okay, what could we have done differently? What will we do differently next time? What did we learn from that? And that's rich and valuable. But your mindset has got to be ready for you to give it. The comparison I made between the physical health and the mental health is I do see it as like the gym. I see, like, when I write the supplement every Sunday, for me, I've got to go to the gym all week to be able to produce something of a reasonable quality that people want to read and listen to. And it keeps me and it keeps my mind where I want it to be. I feel like an Olympic athlete in my head, not so much in the body, but in the head sometimes. I think, right, and then I think, right, like a bit like Dave Brailsford and the British cycling team, where are the 1%? Right, how do I get better? How do I get better at that, and that? Right, what do I need to do? The little things, the little differences that can make the different sources or the different conversations or just the different ways of thinking about things that challenge the status quo. And that keeps me, it gives me a bit of drive and it gives me a bit of purpose around that, even though that in itself, I'm not making any money from doing any of that, but it doesn't always have to be about money. I'm enjoying doing what I do. I've kind of forged that for myself as this position in the property world, and I want to keep growing that position because it feels good. It makes me feel good, and that's mental health positive.
Exactly. Closing sentiment. I think mental and physical health are the two sides of the same coin. From my own experience, the healthier I am, the less mental health issues I have. Sure. The more unhealthy I am, the more mental health issues I am, and the more mental health issues I have, if I don't deliberately get out of the way of it, I end up having more unhealthy, and it's a completely downward. It's a death spiral. So, closing sentiment, and also the world is conspiring against you. It's like those countries you talk about where they are fighting for survival. They're not sitting around worrying about working from home or am I in a good mood or a bad mood? Am I inspired today or am I upset today? They're going out and it's like feast or famine. They're going to go and make it happen. And that's what we were built for. We were built for, if you believe in evolution, we were like cavemen at one point, and we were there, cavemen and women, hunting, surviving, reproducing, trying to keep our kids alive. The body was there to be used, and now we're sitting there flying desks for a living. It's like, it's not conducive to the physical body, and actually AI is probably more conducive to the current place because it's data being transacted rather than what do we actually need these arms and legs for if we're not going to use them. Nice. So round 4. Seeing as we're off the business and economics topic for a moment, I'm going to move this over. So my understanding is you did a degree at Oxford in philosophy, politics, and economics.
That's correct for my sins. Yeah,
For your sins, and it was a master's.
that's
And
right.
I actually personally looked at doing a master's last year at Oxford, and also probably about 5 years ago. Whenever I get a bit lost and I think I need to experiment something, whether it's applying for the ego or it's ready for the next sort of study, it's something that I've looked at. I was really intrigued by philosophy, so I'd like to have a chat and understand what philosophy did you study? What's your view on philosophy? What's your philosophical thoughts? What's your philosophy around business and life?
Okay, so there's a couple of things that I need to say first of all. First of all, when you do an undergrad at Oxford, you get what's called a conferred masters. So they're so up their own, you know where, that effectively they say, well, you've done a bachelor's, but it will become a master's in a few years' time. So it is still a 3-year course, but then after, I think it's 5 years after you graduate, they then confer the masters on you anyway automatically. So it sounds more important than it is. But I did do a master's in business administration as well about 10 years ago for exactly the same sort of reasons as you just laid out as you looking at Oxford, and did that for a year. So from going back to the philosophy question, obviously there's the core founding principles. What do they get you to do when you do the core modules, if you like? The history of Western philosophy we did, so that will take you all the way a little bit from the ancient Greeks and all the rest of it, but really starting at about Descartes and then through, I think, therefore I am, all the way through to someone like Kierkegaard, who's more of a 20th century philosopher. And I think one of the things that I've found fascinating, one of my great regrets really, is that I didn't really enjoy politics, philosophy or economics when I did it at degree level. And then I've become much more interested in all three of those in the 20 plus years since I've done my degree. So politics became much more interesting around the time of Brexit. It just did. There was so much more going on, and and that really sort of piqued my interest. Philosophy, I think.
What puts philosophy, politics, and economics together? Was that one course?
It is.
Philosophy seems to stand out to me as a very, maybe it's just my perception of it, a very intangible, spiritual, thought-provoking, not spiritual, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
deep thinking.
I guess they're all social sciences, but the reason that PPE exists is
Is economics a social science?
It was, yeah, technically, yeah.
Is it?
Yeah, although there are obviously a lot of data-based side of things. You're distinctly different from a natural science, let's say, where you're going to do proper.
I mean, I get it.
experiments,
My understanding of economics is more social science than data-driven like yours.
Yeah,
Mine is, I just understand human nature.
Well, behavioural economics is massive, and that's another thing that's sort of gained in popularity. So what it looked like, the landscape for philosophy when I did my degree versus what it looks like today. Who would you say, if you had to talk about, I mean, there are philosophers in the modern world that I didn't know who those people were 25 years ago, and I would pick people like Jordan Peterson, who have massive influence over people. A lot of although he's a psychologist, a lot of his talk is really at the philosophical level. And you've got a number of other influencers who have got YouTube channels or things like that really are operating at the philosophical level. Reid Hoffman is one. The guy, he was involved in PayPal, and he also co-founded LinkedIn. So the public intellectual is not really much of a UK thing, but it's very much a bit of a US concept.
What do you think of Jordan Peterson and his philosophy? Because I wouldn't have put him down as a philosopher, but I can see what you mean. He has a philosophy around. He's applying social sciences.
See, I would say he's more of a philosopher than he is anything else, really, because
I'd say he's an academic, like a very, really well-read, really well-articulated academic.
But he's taking quite abstract concepts most of the time, and then he's trying to give you actionable advice about how you think as an individual. So all great philosophers have tried to start with a problem and then solve that problem. So I think, therefore, I am Descartes, right? How do you know you are alive? Which is a thing that a lot of big entrepreneurs have very funny ideas about sometimes, such as we're all in part of a simulation and stuff like that. And that's
do you think we are part of a simulation?
That's not one that I would subscribe to realistically. I think I'm a probability.
Do you never have passing thoughts that some things just don't add up?
I would say,
like the universe.
I would say I'm not religious, but I do think there are forces, because I have never found a religion that I would subscribe to all the beliefs of, but I don't think religion is necessarily a negative thing. I think it brings common ground for people. It brings value.
Community. It's the same as anything. Spiritual. Everyone says, "Oh, I'm spiritual now." It's basically a religion. It's a group of people that have a shared thought, belief system.
It's values. It's values.
Value system. Yeah.
The whole of the Western world is built on Judeo-Christian values. That is the way that it is. It doesn't mean necessarily that you've got to read the 10 Commandments every day or
Have you
whatever.
ever had any like deep thoughts, even in a moment of darkness, or a deep thought when you've explored things around the philosophy, or around like simulation, meaning of life, religion, atheists, like, have you ever explored that? Or do you just, I mean, you're a very smiley, happy chap. It's like everything I see of you, you're smiling. I'm like, I need a bit of that. Whereas if I get stuck in a hole sometimes, I can go really asking some questions.
I think it's one of those things. There's a couple of things that are probably relevant here. First of all, my dad for many years was a pretty devout atheist, even to the tune where he wrote books about the contradictions there were in the Bible and stuff like this, right? And you're obviously influenced by that as a child when you're growing up. And he used to have this sort of concept that anybody who subscribed to religion was pretty stupid, really. But as he's got older and he's become more open-minded and he's looked into things like, and he's quite a big fan of Peterson. We went to see Jordan Peterson when he was in Birmingham some time back. And I had this kind of notion that it would be this room of thousands of sort of super enlightened souls. And what it was when we got there actually was normal people who had found Jordan Peterson's teachings useful when they'd hit a really dark spot, like you were just saying, which interested me because that's not how I got into any of it. I just thought, what's all this fuss about? How's this guy approaching all these problems, such as, what's his point when he says clean your room or whatever in 12 Rules for Life? The point is, sort yourself out before you're going to try and sort the world out. Because
credit where due, one of the reasons I like listening to him is similar to why I like reading your stuff, is because it's very intelligent. He's clearly, his brain operates like yours. You've got a very high frequency brain. You're very well read. You clearly have a high level of intelligence. I find him very similar. You can listen to him talk, and you've really got to listen to him talk if you want to hear what he's actually saying. Otherwise, it just looks like a load of American hype, and he's like, speaks so fast and passionately. You think maybe this is the bullshit baffles brain strategy, where it's like, I'm going to speak so fast I confuse people so they think I'm smart. But if you were to transcribe it, break it down, it's absolutely solid and it makes sense and it draws on all of the sciences.
And that comes right back around to why I think he's a philosopher, because philosophers over the...
What would you say his philosophy is?
Well, definitely individual responsibility rather than the collective, for a start. So how can he impact... You're talking about someone who can potentially impact the whole of the world, or a section of the world, with what he sees as almost his teachings, if you like, which, as you said, is really aggregating together evidence-based stuff and saying, look, this is the argument as to why this might be the case. It's not just 12 Rules for Life isn't just about being nasty, make sure your kids don't annoy people and stuff like that. There's a lot, like you said, there's a lot of thought and logic behind it all. So what do you find in religion? How to live your life to an extent. And sometimes it's very, very prescriptive. And a lot of religion is about, you can't do that, you can't do that, you can't do that. And I think that's probably why I've shied away from that over the years. Whereas he's more like, if you want this to happen, then these are the actions that you're going to need to take. Going back to mental health, as we were talking about, if your expectation is something you're going to develop a massive property and it's the first time you've ever done it and it's going to be easy, you need to reset your expectations. It's going to be hard, but life is hard, and you pick your battles and you build yourself to the point where you can deal with those things and still, maybe like a bit like my disposition, come out smiling, because it's putting things into perspective. It's just having a broader thought of, and you know what, the old analogy, you've got 86,400 quid, someone steals a tenner off you. Are you going to spend, how much time are you going to spend being upset about it? That's the same as if someone pisses you off for 10 seconds in a day. Sometimes you just got to move past it and get on with it. And that's the very few things are as bad as they seem right at that point. So I think that's what philosophers have done over the centuries, argued with each other, critiqued each other. This is what you see out of Peterson, people like Ben Shapiro, Sam Harris, Douglas Murray.
Do you think there's a degree of irony that people like that, both of those that you just referenced, appear to, and specifically Jordan Peterson, because he does it quite publicly, have fundamentally got their own set of issues? Jordan Peterson's a very fundamentally flawed person, emotionally, stability-wise.
Physically, yeah, absolutely.
Physically, absolutely crushed in some capacities.
Yeah.
Is there a degree of irony that if we put him on a pedestal and he understands the academics and the philosophy and the things that we should do to achieve X, Y, Z, but then actually at any given moment he's on a knife edge as to whether he's going to have an emotional breakdown or not? Is there not a degree of What's that all about?
I think that's just the art, because remember, we're talking social sciences, so it's like any artist, some of the best musicians in the world have died. What is it called, the 28 Club or whatever, because they've all died when they were 28. I mean, all that stuff comes from deep pain and passion, and that's why, who would do the job that Peterson, I mean, nowadays, I'm sure it's very good, fly around the world, get paid lots of money and all the rest of it. But the journey to get there, he's 15 years worth of YouTube videos of him talking about stuff. And what actually took him to prominence, nearly getting slung out of his job by a hateful mob who said he was completely anti-trans and all the rest of it, Not easy, not something you're going to do overnight, and not necessarily a path you would choose either.
And just closing sentiment before we go on to the next round is just in literally 20 seconds, what's your philosophy? Having studied it, read it, like I say, you've got a very happy, positive energy around you. What is your philosophy around life?
20 seconds, right? I would say put the right people around you, try and collaborate, don't see competition as competition, talk to your competition, put things into perspective, and every day's a new day.
Nice. Right, penultimate round, you're up.
Brilliant. Right, okay. So I had balance in here because I wasn't thinking just specifically work-life balance, but I would say something that I've been working on for a long, long time, and I feel I get a little bit better every day. So what I mean when I say balance is the balance, say, between physical and mental health, or the balance between quality time with family and running multiple businesses, for example. And I think it's something that I've definitely lost sight of at some points over the years. And I've been lucky that I've had a pretty strong anchor in my wife to pull me back in. And also, I've known when I've really got to listen to what she's saying because she's pissed off or it's time to do something differently. And I think as I've got, going back to the philosophy segment, I'm quite a deep thinker. I go away and I think things through, and I try not to snap or make snap decisions like that. I've got that switch in my head that can say, right, we need to do this deal and we need to say yes in the next 15 minutes if we're going to do it. Right, fine, I can get that done. I've built that into myself. But balancing almost everything, that is if you had to pick who was the most balanced individual, I don't know that I could answer that. Who do you aspire to? Because people look at, like we mentioned, Dalio or something, he's a great guy who nowadays gives away so much knowledge, seemingly without any kind of agenda, and that's fantastic. Because again, I would say Dalio's he's an economic philosopher to me. It's just, I think you only know about philosophers when they've been dead 100 years. Maybe that's the.
Maybe that's Naval Ravikant.
But who? Sorry.
Do you know Naval Ravikant?
I don't know.
Well worth checking out. Okay. He's like one of these Silicon Valley millionaires. Now runs a thing called Angel List. But he's wrote a book. It's called The Almanac of Naval Ravikant.
Okay. Recommend
checking it out. It's the sort of modern day stuff you're talking about.
Okay. I'll definitely do that.
But balance, I feel like this is a topic that I feel very comfortable and confident talking about from both an academic point and a practitioner's point, because one of the reasons that property entrepreneurs are so popular is we don't just drive people on making money. It's all about life by design. And the whole reason, so life by design, the concept is your own race at your own pace, which means there's some people on there that want to earn 25 grand a year, working 20 hours a week so they can spend their time with their kids. That's their objective. Yeah. There's other people who want to make 100 million quid a year, work 7 days a week, travel the world, and that's cool. We help the whole spectrum. The big part of that is life by design, not life by comparison. And life by comparison is trying to be what everyone else is. And when you talk about balance, it's like, it's very easy because everyone talks about work-life balance as if it's the top of the mountain. Like that's what we should all aspire to be. But some people are very balanced, especially if they're like tempo profiles. So a tempo profile is very sensory, very cruise control, and they just go through a very steady state. They can hold the same body weight all year.
They glide through life, yeah.
Nothing phases them. They're always smiling. They're having a great day. Everything's cool. Everything's fine. It's very passive. It flows. Whereas you get someone on the other end of the spectrum, like a dynamo, like a high-frequency thinker like you or I, whose brain's off the chart. This week we're doing an Ironman this year. We're training 7 days a week. We're going all in. And then we're completely burnt out at the end of it. We're exhausted. We don't exercise for 5 years. We go and put on a load of weight and we're sick of it. And then we go again and we live this sort of feast and famine style lifestyle. And I think the thing with balance is the same as moderation. Like there's a great quote about moderation that says, everything in moderation, including moderation. And it's like understanding what aligns with what you want. And in my case, and I had the same life coach for 6 years, and she is now the life coach of all the board members who you'll meet tomorrow on Property Entrepreneur. And she said to me last year, because every year it gets to summer season, I'm burnt out, I'm like, I hate this, never doing it again. Like you ask any marathon runner before they cross the line, do you want to go and run another marathon? They're going to say absolutely hell no. But they've prepared for it for 9 months. They've been training for 12 weeks, and then for 2.5 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, they run the marathon. And she says, maybe we don't need you to have this balance that you keep thinking you need. Like just because other people do, it doesn't mean you should. And she says, like, you don't want to keep shoulding all over yourself all the time. I should do this. I should do that. She's like, maybe you're just that sort of person. And then I settled into that for a couple of years of like, I am an extremist. I'm all in. So at the minute I'm training, I'm weight cutting, I'm 4 times weights a week, 4 times cardio, no alcohol, sleep supplements, the lot, tracking everything to the nth degree.
Magnesium.
Magnesium.
Zinc.
Magnesium, zinc. Loads of stuff, ashwagandha, and I'm tracking everything to the nth degree. But come next summer, I'll probably be in the pub garden again. I'll be enjoying my beers, I'm having the burgers, and I sort of live those peaks and troughs. And that's just what I've been because I enjoy novelty. And as I've started to learn more about myself, I learn about my body, I learn about my wealth dynamics profile. I've started doing some more advanced profiling around Myers-Briggs and just learning who I am. And one of the things I've learned recently is I like novelty. And novelty doesn't really come with balance. Novelty is like, this month I'm going on holiday for a month, I'm not going to do anything. Next month I'm going to work 7 days a week. I like that novelty of what's new and exciting.
But in a way, there is balance there, isn't there? If you look at the 2 months as a whole, you have balanced out. You've just done one thing more. I don't think balance necessarily means we've got to live the same life every day by any stretch of the imagination. I think you've got to look more. I mean, one of the things I talk about all the time is quality time, not quantity of time. So people, and I feel this with my own kids, I'm so lucky because I get to, and have engineered a way that I get to spend the quality time doing what I know they want to do and also I want to do with them. And that's loads of fun. The hard bit is it's half term this week and being at home with them, keeping them entertained or making sure they don't spend all the day on watching YouTube or on their tablets or whatever. That's the hard bit because that is hard to balance out. But you have to balance that out by making sure, right, okay, Monday, weather's rubbish, we're not necessarily going to do anything. Tuesday, we're going to do this. Wednesday, and that's, I'm lucky that I subcontract that to my wife. I hope she's not listening to this when I say that. But, I'm lucky because it's dead easy in an hour or 2 or 3 to have a great time and all those times to be brilliant. But there's 168 hours a week and they're only asleep for, sometimes it feels like about 40 of them, to be honest. So
yeah, I get that.
That side of it is, I don't think you've got to look at it as a day thing or a month thing I think you're looking at it as again, it's more of an overall philosophy. So what works for you is what balances out over those 2 periods in a way, balance themselves out. And I've had similar, internal conversations with myself about, for example, should I give up alcohol? Drinking at 45 looks very different to drinking at 15 and 25, right? So it's completely
and what's
different.
your view on this? Because I'm exactly the same. For anyone who listens to the podcast religiously, for the last 4 years, I've had this ongoing battle with alcohol of like, I don't need it in my life anymore. I did 9 months clean, 6 months clean, 3 months clean. I'm clean at the minute. Can't see myself drinking. When I'm not drinking, I'm like, I'm never drinking again. When I'm drinking, I'm like, oh, I can't believe I stopped drinking. It's amazing.
And it does come back to that personality type.
And it's the balance. Like having a glass of red wine or going on a stag do once a year, that's balance, that's fine. But when it becomes a bad habit,
that's it. And when it starts to, again,
where does it fit in your life?
Wearing the wearables, you see even more, like in data.
Resting heart rate,
you
sleep.
See, exactly. With quality of sleep, did you get into any deep sleep? All the rest of that. But I'm not at a stage where I feel, and I don't know if I'll ever get there, that I need to give it up or that I want to give it up. But my consumption is so much less than it used to be.
You say it's balanced.
So
it doesn't get in the way.
Well, I don't think. I'll sometimes look back and think, I haven't had a drink for 3 weeks. I haven't set myself a target of not doing that. It just hasn't happened because it doesn't fit into my daily routine. And I think when daily routines are a problem, I've known people, been close to people, lots of people, members of my family who will just have a drink every day.
Both
But
my parents drank. I mean, unfortunately, my dad's not around anymore. But both my parents drink every day, pretty much every day, and they have done for 40 years.
And
It's just
it's a bit generational.
their generational thing.
Absolutely. But at some point, you've got to ask yourself things that I do every day. I came to when thinking about balance during the pandemic. It was such an interesting time because we already had an operation that could pretty much work remotely. We just didn't, right? So there wasn't loads of work to do to turn that into a COVID-friendly operation. The portfolio worked and it was fine. Within the first week, we were fine. We were ready. We were up and running. We just weren't going to the office or whatever. We used the time to refurb the office instead, you know. And I think the whole of life can be a bit like that. It was so busy, and I realised probably at some point in the April of 2020, I wasn't looking after myself at all. I let my weight slip really badly.
You used to play rugby, didn't you?
I did.
You a rugby guy?
Played rugby to a decent level. Yeah, played rugby to county level. Not very big. I'm only 5'6", so that makes it kind of difficult. But I was in good shape. And I've always been a bit of a, where do you get your edge from, as we've been talking about earlier. And in the 90s, when I was at school, I got my edge from going to the gym because it wasn't like it was today. Nobody used to go to the gym. So because I went to the gym every day, and although I'm sure I'm quite broad, and I've got, you know, so I could bench press massively high weights, shoulder press massively high weights. No one could get anywhere near. So I was in the front row of the scrum, and I was just so much stronger than anybody else because in those days it was, if you were a big fat lad, 18, 20 stone, they logged you in the front row. I was 14 stone and I couldn't put on any more weight. And that was, of course, before the days of knowing lots about nutrition and all the stuff you get off YouTube and everything these days. That would have done me a big favour. But I got stuck there and I couldn't really progress. And I've no natural talent in sport whatsoever. I was just fast and determined, and I trained really hard and I was in great shape. And that was good enough to get me to be a county level player. But I injured my ankle when I was about 22, and it was probably a pretty permanent. It was one of those you could carry on, but I wasn't playing at enough of a level to make it worth carrying on, so I didn't.
Before we go into the last round, that's a nice sentiment to finish on, because the thing about balance as well is it's like, especially for high performers, is the problem sometimes is doing too much of the good stuff. So like a lot of my friends, we talk about overtraining. You know, the issue is we're training too much. We're lifting we're not recovering enough. And that balance of high performance is like if you don't have it, the danger is success in the 28 club that you talked about earlier, or any of the Jordan Peterson, some of my experiences to the extreme, like Avicii, Alexandra McQueen, Amy Winehouse. They have this success train, and everyone thinks what must be. I genuinely think in 50 years, 100 years, we'll look back on celebrity and fame and the riches of as this like poisonous thing that happened, because everyone's aspiring to be this. I actually saw a video on Instagram earlier saying when this girl, I don't even know who she is, but when she got to 100 million followers, that was the darkest period she'd ever had in her life. Whereas everyone's projects that's where you want to get to, and it's like, actually, if there's no balance, it's not. It's detrimental rather than beneficial. Smashing it, right. Pulling it back around for the last round, going back to business, economics, property. What are we expecting of the future? So we talk about the future as in the next 6 weeks, 6 months, 6 years. What are you expecting to see in business, property, the economy, and how can people use that to make some good decisions, do some deals, and make some progress or some money?
I think that's a good 3 time periods you've laid out there: 6 weeks, 6 months, 6 years. 6 weeks relatively easy to predict, of course.
6 sign of the devil, right?
Yeah, very true. 6 months, a little bit harder, but reasonably. 6 years. I think one of the reasons why we invest in property is that if you're in a room full of 100 people from Property Entrepreneur right now, and you said to them, right, put your hand up if you think the market's going to go up in the next 6 months, they're probably quite positive. They're probably quite bought in. Let's say half the hands went up, maybe over half the hands would go up. If you said to them how many think it's going to go up in 6 years, I'm pretty sure 100% of the hands are going to go up, right? So 6 years, as long as we keep it abstract, it's a bit easier to answer. We'll be over this cycle of inflation having led to higher rates than we really want to be able to deal with, and some of that's to do with this. I wrote about this last weekend, the refinancing wall that's coming up, because where it relates to property and to business, you know, we work largely on a 5-year cycle for our debt as, you know, SME developers, investors, etc. So we're on 5-year fixes. Now, some people have historically used 2 years, especially when the market's been going up, because they wanted to get the money out quicker and reinvest it, and that can make sense. But generally speaking, 2 years been a lot harder over the last 12 months because the stress tests have been too high apart from anything else. So that refinancing wall is going to have an impact over the next 6 months plus as more people drop off financing.
And do you think it is when you think about it, the significance of it? How significant do you think it's going to be?
Not as significant as all the
There's
people who write
like
about
600,000-700,000 this year that are going to still to drop off
in terms of
owner
occupier fixed rate mortgages.
I don't know the breaks actually.
But boringly enough, I've done the work on this, right? So the Bank of England have published a few bits about this, and they were talking about a couple of million people dropping off before the end of next year, and then they also looked at what amount per month it was going to cost these people. And then there's a stat that I watched that's I can't remember the acronym now, but it's basically the average big bank variable rate that they're charging. And that's the stat that has been going up and up and up and up. And now we're at 7.9. I think it's 7.93 was the last print on that stat. So if you're off a fixed rate mortgage and you're on a variable, the average bank is charging you 7.93%. And you'll know if you've taken out lots of financing, which I'm sure you have over the last 5 years, the drop-off rates went from one of the big regrets of the banks from 2008 is that a lot of these old mortgages dropped off onto base plus 1.7 and base plus 2, whereas now you drop off onto SONIA plus 4.5. And you look at some of that and it's like, well, hold on, that's 10% today. So that's really, and I feel two ways about that, because some of that I look at and think, is anyone in the credit risk department looking at that and thinking, will people be able to pay that 10% if that's what comes out? But this is a classic can kick down the road situation. And that's the problem they've had with the rates, right? Because they've gone up so much, but almost all the big corporates saw it coming. So they took out debt that had an average duration of 17 years, and they took out more debt than they've ever taken out in the first quarter of 2022. So basically what happened is the CFOs and the people who get paid the big bucks turned around and said, do you know what? Rates have just started going up in the UK. We've got inflation. This is a problem. Debt's still 3% now, or 2.5%. Let's just go for it and re-gear all of this stuff. And this is what I was writing about this a lot last year. I was banging the drum for it in the Sunday supplement, saying, look, really strongly consider breaking off mortgages and fixing them. One of the problems that I saw with people is they had this mental block around early repayment charges, such that they would let a 1 or a 2% early repayment charge be like a brick wall they couldn't scale. I'm like, what are you talking about? It's 1 or 2% of the debt, which is not even 1 or 2% of the property.
Well, December 2021, we said to all of our property entrepreneurs, whatever you got to do, lock in fixed 5-year rates. Brilliant. Now. We did all our portfolio. Adam Goff, who's the host of the program, Property Entrepreneur, you meet him on Friday. He spent 60 grand in early redemption fees, and he was like, this better work. Yeah. He stood up the other day and said it saved him £250,000.
Oh, I spent 250 or something like that, and I reckon over the 5 years it certainly saved well over into the 7 figures. Unbelievable. So I practice what I preach there very much on that front, and we've actually, bizarrely enough, we've still got one loan that's on a 4% rate that hasn't completed yet on a portfolio because it's been so slow. And in that interim period, we've lost high 5 figures, if not 6 figures, to the interest payments we've overpaid, but we've got the rate locked in. The lender's actually been quite good. Although they've been terrible, they've actually been quite good at preserving the rate. And
so what are we thinking
completes next week, happily.
Oh, yeah, congratulations. What you've done well there. So for 6 weeks, 6 months, 6 years, what are we expecting on rates, property prices?
So six weeks, I think we'll go into this December will look like a more...
Any more rate rises before Christmas?
I don't think so. I think we're 1 day away from the next Bank of England meet, and I think we'll probably stick at 5.25. October's CPI and inflation.
Do you think they should have gone up to 5.5?
I said I think they should have done.
Same.
But
just put the last nail in the coffin.
Yeah, exactly. And
scare the living daylights everyone. It's done now. Then it would have been a stop. Now it's just a suspense.
They haven't had the balls all the way through to actually do what they really needed to do and make those last difficult decisions. But I can understand why it was the vote was 5-4 on the committee.
Split,
It was close. I also don't think the governor knows what he's doing, which doesn't help very much. But is an amazing correlation between people who get into positions like Chancellor of the Exchequer and Bank of England Governor who don't understand the economics well enough to do the job, in my opinion.
Big boats and small rudders.
I would say that because I'm an economist, so at heart. So I would say that, but I think there's plenty of evidence of it as well, So I think we'll go into a pretty standard sort of December. Market will be quite quiet. We'll see what happens early January. No more rate rises. I think prices will be fairly flat, which of course everyone forgets. Although they're flat, they've gone down in real terms 15%. right? So going back to my early 90s analogy earlier on, like I said, they were down 35, 40% in real terms, although that was on the back of a rise it trebled, whereas we've had a market where it went up 25%, something like that, and then it's flattening out a bit. So if you look at real prices versus like 1st of Jan 2020, today they're cheaper. If you look at prices compared to wages compared to 1st of Jan 2020, they're cheaper. Now, this is why there's a massive, go to your 6 years, massive opportunity, because although the market doesn't react overnight and it always does these strange things, if you look at the trend line of the real house price, right, real house price in 2007, in today's money was about 333 grand. In today's money, it's about 260 grand. This is nationwide figures, so they're not perfect, but they've got the best data on this sort of stuff. So we are, what's that, 23, 24% below where that was in 2007, and we're underneath the 40-year trend by about 23, 24%.
Then when you contrast that with affordability, and like the only thing that you could even, if you wanted to have a semi-intelligent argument about the future of property prices, the only thing that would fundamentally push against, because demand and supply, I mean, we're already now pricing in the next property shortage, aren't we? Because construction stopped. So it's like, right, so now you stop supply, demand's already through the roof. As soon as liquidity and rates goes down, we've already priced in that next spike because we're shy 100, 200,000 houses a year, whatever.
Goes back to your below build cost strategy and stuff and all the rest of it. And those are the fundamentals. That's how you build a 50-year, 100-year business, whatever it's going to be.
It's price cost averaging, isn't it?
By having good fundamentals, and the fundamentals are better than they've ever been from the investment perspective. I mean, what we forget things like
just coming back to that point before we move on is when the one thing that when you look at it sort of strategically and you think if there were to be obviously the black swans, we don't know what it is until it happens. Then it seems obvious.
Definition of the black swan.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Yeah. It seems obvious. Affordability. You look at affordability as multiplier of earnings or percentage of income. It looks through the roof, doesn't it? And you just think if something was going to make a reason why the thing would tank, that sort of seems to lean on it. But then everything else says that this thing's going to go and it's going to go and it's going to go.
You know what, though? When you look at I've done the work on this again and looking at, because this is something that's in the papers all the time and it's actually not based in reality. So you go back to houses in real terms are cheaper than they've been since 1997 compared to where weekly earnings were in 1997.
Is that right?
Yeah. And we've just, I wrote, in July, I wrote a long piece about this with all the data in it that I did the research myself. And you look at the ONS have only got figures since 2005 for rents. That's when they started collecting figures. And rent today compared to wages is 15% lower. This is today, the most recent figures we've got. Obviously, rents are rocketing at the moment, but are still 15% lower as a percentage of your wage than they were in 2005. And that just tells you how much noise...
Relative or in real terms?
So, it's the same thing because if you adjust for inflation, it's still 15%. If you adjust both of them for inflation. But in real...
Like relative as in like a percentage of the income?
Yeah, it's 15%, it was 15% more.
See, that surprises me. That
surprised
really surprises me.
It surprised me an awful lot. But those are I don't argue with the ONS, those are the real bits of data. But nobody talks about it because it doesn't write headlines, So the affordability I mean, look, private sector wages up 8% on average. What people forget is we get obsessed with these sort of cross-sectional metrics like that. Wages are up 8%. But what you forget is, go back to your 5-year mortgage people dropping off. If you got underwritten in 2018, you were stress tested at 5.5%. You also had yours and your partner's job, probably, in 2018. And since then, your wages have gone up. Right? And you've probably been promoted. So over time, remember, your income doesn't go up like that because of inflation. Even if you adjust it for inflation, most people, until they get to sort of 50, 55, they're getting more money because they're getting promoted or they're changing jobs to get more money or whatever. So people are actually way better off than they were. But everything is so miserable that you just don't see the wood for the trees. And this is why the economy sort of lumbers on like this slightly wounded beast. Even at the best efforts of some people, like the governor of the Bank of England, to bugger it up, they can't manage to screw it up enough. It goes on, and it's stronger than we realise. It might be. I do like your analogy of this sort of overweight, whatever, but that's more about some of the entitlement and the privilege points that we made earlier on. The economy rolls on, and people make more money.
I mean, for us as the tiniest percentage of people who know how to play the game, it's beautiful. You look at it and you think, what other industry would you want to be in where the UK is property has been, I mean, it's always been reasonably recession proof, but you throw in the pandemic and we got through that. Now you've got the macro demand against supply, and you just think, I can't see this. Not, and the fact that HMOs have got a second wind or fifth wind,
Yeah.
and you got 100% occupancy, rents going through the roof. I'm thinking, I tapped out of that market.
Removal of the banding.
The banding of rooms.
You
just think, wow, how can this get any better?
Oh, the fundamentals are outrageously good at the moment, but because, like you said earlier on about inflation, it's about people's
the planning
expectations.
system's just clogged up. So it's like, if you do manage to get a site through, it's a ball ache, but it's like, it's gold dust. It's like you're printing money. It's
and nobody wants to fix. There's no appetite to fix that.
Or any expertise to
level.
pick. I mean, if they did untap it, imagine if they untapped it, we could go to building 750,000 houses a year. They're all prefab. There was a government. If this was a capitalist economy and a big developer who understood the politics and the economics.
If it was Dubai.
Oh yeah.
Basically.
There you go. And it would just overnight.
Yeah.
But then you'd have the big problem like China have got now, wouldn't you? Where you've got debt everywhere. There's empty properties.
Well, they've made a funny mistake because they have just fundamentally not looked at their own demographics and said, like, while things are roaring along, and that's why you've got these developments in places where they're 40% empty, because population of working age is now dropping in China, and that's why a lot of people are saying their golden age is over. Whereas India, for example, for the next 20 years, the demographics and everything look quite irresistible. Interesting enough, in the UK, over the next 10 to 15 years, we've got a lot of people who are going to get into that sort of 20 to 35 segment. We've got a growing 20 to 35 segment, and that's going to mean more renters to start with, apart from anything else. Birmingham is one of the youngest cities in Europe, if not the youngest city in Europe, and it's got a massive roadmap for rentals. Of course, the problem is supply and demand are almost so far gone, they're not even in the conversation anymore.
I know, right?
And affordability is the key bit. But affordability is nowhere near as bad. Look, in London, it's slightly different because I think in London, from what I've seen, there's quite often 3 people sharing a one-bedroom flat, and they're pushed to the limit of what they're earning because the living wage and the London supplement is just not reflective of how much more expensive it can be just to get around. Depends what you do. Depends how you live your life. It's much easier to spend. It's quite difficult to live in Nottingham and spend 500 grand a year without wasting it quite a lot. It wouldn't be that hard in London because the restaurants would be so much more expensive. All the rest of that would be so much more expensive. Well,
when we talk about luck, Nottingham is actually, or at least it was a couple of years ago, in the UK, it was the highest level of disposable income. So it's or quality of living. So basically, for the money you earned and the property prices, it was a sweet spot. So from an investor's point of view, it was fantastic.
I've always invested a lot more in the East Mids than the West Mids, even though I live in the West Mids, because the regional GDP is a bit higher. The houses which were cheaper, they still are just about cheaper, but East Mids has gained about 10% on the West Mids over the
It's always sort of top 5 for like yield, buy-to-let, property growth.
And average income and stuff like that. And it's all good because going back to your below build cost stuff as well, we put tons and tons of stock where you're not going to buy that. How are you going to build a house these days for 80 grand?
Yeah. Well, 55 grand back in the day, like in Nottingham, where I used to live and used to invest. 55 grand, you couldn't get it for 150 now.
No,
it's like
no.
So what for people who are listening to this and thinking about doing deals, what to watch out for, where the opportunities are? Where do you think the opportunities are over the next 6 to 12 months?
I think there's massive opportunities in vendor financing stuff, huge opportunities. We don't have quite the roadmap or the outline they do in the US where people have got long fixed rates on stuff, but we have picked up some deals where we've bought companies that have got fixed debt at a low rate. And where the edge has been for us is we're valuing that loan now. That loan is an asset, right? Because it's fixed at 3% or whatever. And people are forgetting that in the deal. They've got a different reason to sell it. So,
and are you just taking on the debt, or are you taking on? So you're not actually keeping the cash.
Taking on the debt, and we might
giving
be
them the cash.
And we might be then using like deferred consideration, so that the vendor's going to get paid over a number of years. We've had quite a good spot this year where vendors have been happy to crystallise a price because they're worried about tax. And I think this is a big thing for people who are listening to play on, certainly before April next year, and probably April 2025, given when the election's going to drop and all the rest of it. But there's a big fear out there that Labour are going to raise capital gains tax. So if it goes from 20% to 40% at the top level, I'm talking about for companies, obviously it's 28% for property, but it's the same logic. People want to crystallise those numbers now, and we've done a couple of deals where people have lent us money back. So what they really wanted to do was crystallise the price, pay the tax at the lower level, and then they were happy to take a bit of savings income from it, and they could walk away from the portfolio because they couldn't really be bothered to run it anymore or whatever. So those sorts of creative deals, I think, will be massive. I think people need to look closely at. It's a good time to be sharing equity with people rather than necessarily taking on debt. If you can get the pricing and the splits and the deal and everything right. I'm not recommending to anyone jump into bed with people and JV straight away. I see that far too often, and it worries me. But if you've got people who want to take on equity investments who are going to take a 6-year view, not a 6-month view, they're very valuable to have in your armoury. And yeah, do you know what? You're going to give away some of your uplift on some of the deal there. But how much are you going to gain in the future?
Yeah, or just broker the deal. Like if you can't get into bed with them, just somebody messaged me yesterday, one of our clients, and they said, "What should I charge?" And I said, 33 up to 33%. It's basically a flip. Portfolio of HMOs needs to get sold. Like it can't refinance, whatever. And he said, "We can flip it. We've got a buyer, we've got a seller. This guy's putting all the money in." And I said, "We'll just broker the deal, take up to a third." And on a 300 grand margin, it's 100 grand for giving you a phone number and a postcode.
Absolutely.
It's like, why not?
Absolutely.
And there's no risk. That's the thing right now, isn't it? You don't want to be sitting on £10 million worth of bridging.
One of the reasons, going back to one of the previous points about why is the market not crashed like some people thought it would? The figures say about 56% of landlords are sitting on unencumbered property.
Yeah, I did actually read some stats about that, which again surprised me.
Versus 44% leveraged. Right? So over half of them aren't affected a jot by the interest rate side of things. They're affected by inflation. Most of those people will have some sort of business mindset, although a lot of them are only 1 and 2 property owners who are still keeping the rents the same. You know, there's this huge elastic band that at some point is going to snap because, like you said earlier on, the market has to adjust. 6% yield, 6% debt doesn't work for leveraged buyers. Now, not everyone's a leveraged buyer. So it only knocks out 44% of people who are using leverage for a start, which is why it isn't quite as damaging as we might think it might be.
The people who are unencumbered are benefiting from the market conditions of forcing rents up because everyone else is paying increased corporation tax, increased rates.
What businesses do you think of any size have not taken advantage of any? You'll remember from, like, for example, you'd buy materials for a development, yeah? Wood price started to go down again in like March, April last year. But still by July, August, people like Juicens or whoever were still sending out a monthly email saying, this is up 8%, this is up, because they could.
Because it's boring, and they just bore those prices in.
They're just gouging, because it's business, you know, that's the society we live in. And then when they couldn't get away with it anymore, suddenly the prices started to fall more. But people took the opportunity, rather than saying, well, we've got to put price up by this much, they see an opportunity, and they took it. We had a site where there's a bar in there. And at one of the, I went up there to check on it, and one of the staff said, "I'll put the price of the beer up by £1 a pint." I was like, "What? How? What's the reaction been like?" Oh, people don't care.
Well, this is playing the game, right?
What? Wow! I couldn't get my head around that.
It's like driving instructors. When fuel price went through the roof, every single driving instructor went from like £40 an hour to £55 an hour.
Yeah.
Fuel prices come back down.
They ain't coming
Has
down.
anyone reduced their prices? Of course they haven't. And also in the current market, when you talk about unencumbered and like my bank debt is 14%. So like during pandemic, paid down my portfolio. Yeah. So a lot of this stuff is beneficial to me, not detrimental. Mm-hmm. And I did my annual exercise of targets for next year, and I was thinking, looking at all the opportunities, development, buy, flips, packaging. And I was like, do you know what I'd be best to do? I'd be best to use my cash that I make next year and just pay off the last bit of my mortgages. Because if I've got debt at 10, like commercial loans at 8% plus fees, there's a logic that actually you're better off in some markets paying off your debt than you are going and doing more development because it's risky. It's
time, effort, and risk, isn't it? All of those things have to come together for a decision like that. And when we've had a couple that have hit the sort of 10% sort of mark, which are really difficult to refinance. Only small individual properties, and we've gone, well, hold on.
Just pay the mortgage off.
Why are we looking at new opportunities? We can go and sit there and make 10%.
Yeah, I can make 100 grand a year just paying off a £750,000 loan with Shawbrook. And
that's part of what will define the investment landscape while things as they are at the moment. You've got 30-year bonds returning 5%. Institutions who've been looking very closely at things like build to rent, for example, they've got the same problem. They were taking 3%, 3.5% yields out of projects when the interest rate was nothing, right? So that's 3.5% premium above they're going to take 8.5% returns today. No, they're not, because they're not there. So what do? Well, they just buy the bonds.
And all of this stuff,
not bothering with the property projects.
All of this stuff that leans on the big boys, so like the pension funds, the corporates, the LNGs, the prefab buildings, the build to rent. all it needs is an economic shock, and all those guys run for the hills. You know, modular housing seems to have been shelved again.
Yeah.
Like LNG have closed their factory.
They hate risk. That's what they hate risk. And they move at the speed of a supertanker because they are these gigantic organisations.
And when a cycle's 15 years, by the time they just about get going in year 7 or 8, they get 1 or 2 years run. The whole thing disappears again, and it's back to us guys who are like dynamic, flexible, can weather the storm.
Can move quickly. Yeah, absolutely.
Do you think what do you think will happen in the next election?
I think Labour will win.
Yeah.
I think Labour will win. I think although I don't like sort of foregone conclusions, I think
Ryan appears to be on the wall, doesn't it?
Look at mid-beds in the last by-election. I mean, look, I know Nadine Dorries didn't turn up or whatever, but still, listening to the people on LBC or whatever, because I love listening to LBC. It's a great.
I had to stop listening to it. Nigel Farage. Not
too
Nigel.
angry.
Who's the host on there? That's the morning host. The
James
chap?
O'Brien. Is that what you're thinking
Potentially.
of? Or
He's
Nick
just
Ferrari, one or the other.
Nick Ferrari.
Yeah.
Negative, aggressive,
Yeah.
rude.
It can be.
And I'm like, my blood used to boil listening to it. I had to stop listening to it.
I love it to listen to what, because it tells you what the general public are thinking, you know. And people were phoning in from mid-beds the day after that by-election, because I was driving somewhere and I was listening to it on the way up there. And I couldn't believe that they sounded so upper middle class and they'd all voted Labour. And he just thought, blimey, this is a real, you know, Starmer would have to do something seriously wrong not to win. It's not, look, crazy things have happened in the past. 92 was pretty crazy. 87 was a bit crazy.
But on face value, you look at, you're thinking it's blue against red and these polar opposites. But the reality is nowadays, they're so close in policy, manifesto. It's like...
And that's an interesting thing. That's a really interesting
their
thing.
philosophies are just very aligned now.
That's why Corbyn couldn't win.
Everyone's trying to keep everyone happy.
But that's the political cycle, you know. It goes back to the centre and then it will drift back out to the extremes.
If
the Conservatives get beat, they might well elect Liz Truss again, who will be on the further right side.
Lever up,
and then
capitalist.
They won't win because you don't win from a far position, because Boris, although they said like, oh, he's far right about this, he's not at all. He's a liberal bloke, really. He's still quite a centrist. And he's an incredible character who wins elections. You know, that go back
gives everyone the confidence.
Well, it's the celebrity culture thing you were talking about as well. I genuinely spoke to people who, after the election, voted for Boris because they liked his hair.
Yeah, well,
but these were people who never would have voted Conservative in a minute. They didn't vote. They didn't look at it as Tory, Conservative. They looked at it as Boris, and they voted for Boris.
And he's getting torn to pieces now because of, which is, I mean, I'm not a big. Obviously, there's things you should and shouldn't do in the middle of a pandemic. To then be judged 3 years later. We're just looking for things to worry about. We need to go and worry about the economy, not. But there's obviously big things in there. I'm not being blasé about that.
No.
But the sentiment is, through a pandemic where the world was just shocked and the country were paranoid and mental health, etc. Boris got up there every day and was optimistic and driven and gave you that sort of chest beating. Let's do this. We're going to be good. Whereas if you'd have had any of the other people up there with the facts of like, this many people have died. It could be a travesty. It could be this. It's like. He actually did a good leadership job through there. But he's never going to rebuild the economy. Whereas Rishi Sunak appears, although I've got friends who've met him who've said they've got a different opinion, he appears on face value to have the full skill set you would need for a restructuring the economy, getting the growth scale going again, balancing the books.
Economy-wise, he'll be the best that we'll have for many years. Politically, I think he's a little bit naive. But I do agree with you about Boris.
But is he politically naive because he doesn't know how to play the game?
I just think he's only been in 5, 6, 7 years. And also, he's someone who has had his great deal of success by using his brain and his intelligence as an economic nous, not by remembering that it's a viper's nest and everyone's going to stab you in the back.
Well, that's what I said on Property Entrepreneur the other day. What he's doing will win the economy.
Yeah.
But it won't win an election.
Exactly.
And the danger is he's got to win the election to stay in the game.
And that's exactly, going back to John Major, that's what in 1992, they did all the hard decisions they needed to take right there and then to get inflation under control. They did it. When they handed the torch over to Labour in 1997, actually things were in really good shape. If you go back and look at the GDP and the economy and where we were growing and where we were going in 97, there was a chance to do what Labour did do. And they did do it with a degree of skill. But also, a lot of that was based on the platform they've been given. It's a bit like what happens after World War II. You know, Churchill gets booted out, even though now he's lauded as a massive hero, because everybody, for the time, they just look at, like at the moment, they look at Sunak and go, it's your fault, the cost of living crisis. It's all your fault. It's all your... And that's just people. And we'll see whether it's a 5-year or a 10-year term. But I think that's one of the big drivers as to why people will turn and flip their vote. The challenge will be... Coming into being Rachel Reeves right now is something not easy at all. And then you've also got to control the rabid far left of the party that's been given a lot of empowerment under Corbyn. And one thing Starmer didn't really do is he didn't really kill it off. You know, they're still there or thereabouts, and he's going to have to be quite cautious because otherwise there's going to be some kind of uprising to try and take him out once they've got power. And that, you know, nothing scared me more than John McDonnell being Chancellor of the Exchequer. That was the most frightening thing that I could ever have imagined.
What are you guys doing about corporation tax gone up this year?
Well, obviously, we've got two different problems, really. One is this sort of aggregation across vehicles where there's common control, because we've got a lot of JVs and things like that. So we're not getting if we've got 5 companies between 2 of us, then we're only getting a 10 grand allowance at each company before we go and paying 26.5%. Right? What's it supposed to do? It's supposed to make
Was it 26.5%?
Because it goes 19 up to 50k, then it's 26.5 to 300, and then it becomes 25.
Where's the extra 1%?
The 1.5 is supposed to make up the 19 to 25 on average as you get to the 300. So it's like blended. It's a bit like, you know, if you earn over 100, your personal allowance starts to get eaten away. So you're actually paying 60% tax between 100 and 125k, which is obviously a bit of a killer because there's other things you might lose as well. So some people say it's 70, 80% tax. So what you should do, economically, what you should do is you should be reinvesting and all the rest of it.
But then even in property, like unless you can put it as a expense, you know, it's not a capital allowance necessarily. Like how much of that net profit? I mean, I'm looking at my tax bills for this year, and they're going to be hundreds of thousands of pounds, and I'm like, that's not what I signed up for.
no, exactly. And this is why, you know, people who are sitting in your seat are then thinking, you know, should I go abroad?
Yeah, I mean, Dubai, Portugal, it's like...
Well, Portugal have changed their NHR rules, just bear in mind. So Portugal's off the agenda at the moment, yeah. They're withdrawing it.
Because that was 10 years tax-free, wasn't it?
Non-habitual residents, stopping the clock for capital gains and all the rest of it. It was a brilliant solution for it. Malta's still viable, though. But this is it. This is what... We're losing 1,500 ultra-high net worths a year in the UK.
Well, I showed a diagram on Property Entrepreneur the other day of the net flow of millionaires around the world, and UK is like minus whatever it is, whereas Singapore, well, obviously like all
Dubai,
the sort of
is sucking them in like a someone told me the stat and it's something insane. People with a net worth over 500 million, how many have moved to Dubai over the last 3 years? It's a huge amount. And there's so many
necessity in some cases. It's like you would just look at it and be like, I can't afford to stay in this country. Sort of
and the golden visa system, they've done some clever things with what they used to do at a really basic level, it seems to me, in the Emirates, is they used to get the best people in the world over, they pay them more money, and there'd be no tax. And that was very attractive. What they've now worked out is, right, what we need to do is then we need to keep those people. Right? We don't want to let them go back home when they finish working or whatever it is. We need to keep those people. So how do we make sure, you know, what keeps a lot of very high net worths in London? Yeah, the non-dom rules. And obviously Labour are talking about scrapping those. And you will see a bit of an exodus from prime London because people aren't going to just sit there. You know, if you're worth 500 million, a billion plus, whatever, you're not just going to suck it up and suddenly start paying 20% tax on your profits that you don't need to because you're a non-domicile person. They also don't realise.
So are you just going to foot the bill?
So we either are buying companies with losses, are using which it's not really necessarily a new thing we've done before. We're making sure we do as much work as we can that can be expensed against P&L when we're talking property. So if it's replacement work, legitimately, obviously the accountants have got to sign all that off, but we're doing that. But if you're taking it out, at the moment, my kids are where they are. I think they're at the best place for them, and I don't want to move them to a different country. I'm happy with their education. I'm putting that first, and I'm closing my eyes when I pay HMRC.
Well, that's it. And I suppose it's a good problem to have, isn't it? It's like we can't complain. And obviously, as you've got family and kids, there's allowances and games you can play there to mitigate it. But did you follow Scott Galloway at all?
I know the name.
It's like American. He seems to have a second wind. I used to follow him about 5 years ago.
Is it a professor at NYU or something?
Yeah.
So
he's like,
I've seen him talk a couple of times. I wouldn't say I follow him, but
he's our sort of bag. You know, he's like just a normal person. Like he's savvy. He knows economics. He knows deals, and he's just very easy to listen to because he knows what he's talking about. He was saying basically the danger zone, which is what he called the workhorses, is the people that are earning between 200 grand a year and £1 million a year because they're paying 50% rate tax. They're going to work. Like that's the danger. When you get into the tens of millions of money, you're basically using these really advanced tax structures, which maybe it's a thing in America. But I just completely got the logic of like, when you're up in that, there's games you can play with capital allowances,
For sure.
various like structures.
Well, people don't understand a lot of this stuff, do they? Like, it's one thing being people like Musk, you know, they have gigantic personal loans because what they don't want to do is sell their shares because A, they don't want to sell the shares in their companies, and B, if they do, they've got to pay the capital gains.
Well, he exercised that option, didn't he? He paid the largest tax bill in history.
Yeah, well, he wanted to get. I think because he wanted to get rid of a few shares, and he thought the price was quite high. But he can't come out and say that.
He had those options that were expiring, didn't he? He had to use them, or he would have lost them.
Right, and then he had to sell them, did he? I didn't realise that.
Well, I think he had to exercise the option. I don't know what he did, but
there would have been tax either
his
way.
bill
so
was like 20 billion or so. I don't quote me.
No, it was the biggest anyone had ever paid. I think it was maybe 30 billion. So it's crazy.
Absolutely crazy. Anyway, that last round has run well over. I've absolutely enjoyed that. I've absolutely loved that. Any closing sentiments for those who are listening about what to do in the next 12 months? Words of advice or just top tips to finish?
I think the big thing is don't listen to too much of the noise. I'm obviously going to say read the Sunday supplement, but I don't write it with an agenda. I write it based on what I really think is happening.
And I personally read it, and I think it's huge value, so I recommend it.
If it was going to hit the fan, and I really thought it was going to hit the fan, and the Black Swan was right there, I'd like to think if I've been writing it in 2007, I'd have been saying, do you know what? There's a lot of leverage out here at the moment, and it's not covered, and prices can't keep going up forever. So as and when I see things change, I will say it. I would say turn off the news as much as possible and make sure you're looking after physical and mental health, definitely, and do the work, because it's so easy to get distracted. You mentioned comparison earlier on, probably the thing I say to my kids more than anything, comparison is the thief of joy, right? 100%. Peterson is big on compare yourself to who you were yesterday. That's the only comparison you've got to make. And that's so easy to say. And it's difficult to do, especially with all the messaging we've all got in all of our faces all the time. But take those words seriously and act on them, and remember, just try and be better than you were yesterday.
Wise words. And I would say that for the first time, which was only in the last 10 years, where I got absolute confidence in myself, was when I stopped comparing myself to others and just felt really content of running my own race at my own pace. Yeah. And everything's so much more enjoyable because, the elusive there never comes. There's always somebody ahead of you. And wise words. Do you want to smash the bell to finish us? Daniel Hill, Adam Lawrence, 6 rounds. Smashed it.
Thanks for having me, Daniel. Enjoyed it.